This biblical truth explains why you feel spiritually lost right now. Have you ever reached a moment where you still believe in God, yet somehow feel completely disconnected from Him? You pray, but your words seem to echo back in silence. You read Scripture, but the verses that once filled your heart with life now feel distant. You attend church, listen to sermons, and try to remain faithful, yet deep inside there is a growing question you are afraid to say out loud. Where is God? Many believers carry this burden in secret. They smile in public while privately wondering why their spiritual life feels empty. They begin to question themselves. Some even wonder if they have done something wrong, if God is disappointed in them, or if they have somehow lost their way beyond recovery. But what if the very feeling that is troubling you right now is not evidence that God has abandoned you? What if one of the most important truths in the Bible explains exactly why you feel spiritually lost at this moment? Throughout Scripture, some of God's closest servants experienced seasons of confusion, silence, waiting, and spiritual dryness. Yet these difficult seasons were not signs of rejection. They were often the beginning of a deeper transformation God was preparing within them. The truth is that spiritual lostness is not always a sign that you are moving away from God. Sometimes it is the uncomfortable process God uses to lead you closer than you have ever been before. And if you stay with me until the end, you may discover that what feels like a spiritual crisis today could actually be the doorway to a stronger faith, a clearer purpose, and a deeper relationship with God than you ever imagined possible. Why feeling spiritually lost does not mean God has left you. One of the greatest misconceptions many believers carry is the belief that feeling spiritually lost automatically means God is far away. The Bible tells a very different story. When we experience confusion, emotional exhaustion, unanswered questions, or spiritual dryness, our human instinct is to interpret those feelings as evidence that God has withdrawn His presence. Yet feelings are not always reliable indicators of spiritual reality. Think about the life of David. Some of the most powerful prayers in the book of Psalms were written during moments when he felt abandoned, overwhelmed, and desperate for God's presence. In Psalm 22, David cried out, asking why God seemed so far away. Yet this same man remained deeply loved by God throughout his struggles. His emotions told him one thing. God's reality was something entirely different. The same pattern appears throughout Scripture. Joseph felt forgotten in prison. Moses spent years wandering in obscurity. Elijah reached a point of complete emotional exhaustion and wanted to give up. Even these faithful servants experienced seasons where God's plan made little sense. Yet God had never stopped working. The danger is that when spiritual confusion arrives, many people begin to pull away from God precisely when they need Him most. They stop praying because they feel nothing. They stop seeking because they see no immediate results. They begin measuring God's presence by their emotions instead of His promises. But Scripture repeatedly reminds us that God's presence is not dependent on what we feel in a particular moment. Often, the periods when God seems silent are the very seasons when He is accomplishing His deepest work beneath the surface. Just as roots grow unseen beneath the ground, before visible fruit appears above it, spiritual growth often happens in places the human eye cannot see. That means your current confusion may not be proof of God's absence. It may be evidence that He is developing something within you that cannot be built during comfortable seasons. The question is not whether God has left you. The real question is whether you are willing to trust Him when you cannot clearly see what He is doing. And that leads to a biblical pattern that appears again and again throughout Scripture. A pattern that reveals why so many faithful people experience seasons of spiritual uncertainty before stepping into a deeper purpose. The biblical pattern, hidden in seasons of spiritual confusion. If you carefully study the lives of the people God used most powerfully, you will notice a pattern that appears again and again. Before clarity came confusion. Before purpose came uncertainty. Before breakthrough came a season where nothing seemed to make sense. This pattern is so common throughout Scripture that it cannot be ignored. Consider Joseph. God gave him extraordinary dreams about his future. Yet almost immediately his life seemed to move in the opposite direction. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and forgotten in prison. Every circumstance suggested that God's promises had failed. Imagine how confusing that must have felt. Joseph had received a vision from God, yet his reality appeared completely disconnected from that promise. Day after day, year after year, he lived without understanding why God allowed such suffering. What Joseph could not see was that God was preparing him long before revealing the full purpose behind his pain. The same thing happened with Moses. Before becoming the leader who would deliver Israel, he spent decades in the wilderness. The man who once lived in a palace became a shepherd in a desert. His dreams, ambitions, and expectations were stripped away. To anyone looking from the outside, it would have seemed as though his life had lost direction. Yet those hidden years became the very foundation for the calling God would later reveal. Even the disciples experienced this pattern. When Jesus was crucified, their entire understanding of God's plan collapsed. Fear replaced confidence. Confusion replaced certainty. Everything they believed was happening suddenly appeared to be falling apart. But what looked like defeat was actually preparation for resurrection. This is one of the most important biblical truths many believers miss. God often works in stages we do not immediately understand. There are seasons when He reveals the destination, and seasons when He focuses on transforming the traveler. Most people love the destination. Few appreciate the process. Yet it is within the process that faith is refined, character is strengthened, and dependence on God becomes real. Perhaps the reason you feel spiritually lost right now is not because your faith is failing. Perhaps it is because God is leading you through a chapter that cannot be understood until later. The Bible shows us repeatedly that confusion is often temporary, but the lessons learned within it can shape an entire lifetime. And there is one hidden obstacle that makes these seasons even harder. A force that quietly distorts our perception and makes God's presence seem farther away than it really is. How pain quietly distorts your ability to recognize God's presence. One of the most difficult realities of spiritual life is that pain changes the way we see everything. When the heart is wounded, the mind begins to interpret situations differently. Disappointment feels permanent. Delays feel like rejection. Silence feels like abandonment. And gradually a person can begin to believe that God is distant when, in reality, their pain is shaping the lens through which they view Him. This is not a new struggle. Throughout Scripture, many faithful people wrestled with this very challenge. Think about the prophet Elijah after his great victory on Mount Carmel. He had witnessed God's power in an extraordinary way. Fire had fallen from heaven. The nation had seen undeniable evidence of God's presence. Yet shortly afterward, fear and emotional exhaustion overwhelmed him. He fled into the wilderness convinced that everything was falling apart. He felt isolated, defeated, and alone. His pain became so intense that he could no longer see clearly what God was doing around him. The circumstances had not changed as much as his perception had. Many believers experience the same thing today. A season of loss, heartbreak, disappointment, betrayal, financial pressure, unanswered prayers, or emotional exhaustion can slowly cloud spiritual vision. The soul becomes tired. Hope becomes harder to maintain. Confidence begins to weaken. Without realizing it, people start looking for proof that God has forgotten them. And because pain naturally focuses attention on what is missing, they often overlook the countless ways God continues to sustain them. The enemy understands this principle well. He knows that if he cannot destroy your faith outright, he can attempt to distort your perspective. He can encourage you to focus only on what has not happened yet, only on what was lost, only on what feels broken. But God's presence has never depended on your ability to feel it perfectly. In the first book of Kings, chapter 19, God did not reveal Himself to Elijah through the wind, the earthquake, or the fire. Instead, He spoke through a gentle whisper. That detail matters, because when pain becomes loud, God's voice often seems quiet, not because He has stopped speaking, but because suffering creates so much internal noise that hearing Him becomes more difficult. This is why spiritual maturity is not learning to trust God only when His presence feels obvious. It is learning to trust Him when emotions fluctuate, circumstances remain uncertain, and answers have not yet arrived. Many times God is closest when he appears silent. Many times he is working most deeply when nothing seems to be changing. And nowhere is this lesson more important than during those painful seasons when heaven feels silent and every prayer seems to disappear into the darkness. What Scripture reveals about waiting when heaven feels silent. Few experiences test faith more than waiting. Not ordinary waiting, but the kind of waiting where you have prayed repeatedly, searched sincerely, and trusted as best you can, yet nothing seems to change. The kind of waiting where heaven feels silent. Many people assume that silence means inactivity. They believe that if God is not speaking in ways they can immediately recognize, then he must not be doing anything at all. But Scripture teaches the opposite. Some of God's greatest works were accomplished during periods of apparent silence. Consider Abraham. God promised that he would become the father of many nations, yet years passed without fulfillment. Every passing season seemed to contradict the promise. Human logic suggested that the opportunity had already slipped away. Still, God was working through the waiting. Consider David. He was anointed to become king while still a young man. Yet long before he sat on the throne, he endured years of uncertainty, danger, and hardship. The promise was real, but the fulfillment required a process. The waiting was not wasted. It was preparation. This is one of the hardest truths for modern believers to accept. We often want immediate answers, immediate direction, and immediate clarity. Yet God frequently develops patience, dependence, wisdom, and trust through seasons where answers arrive slowly. The waiting itself becomes part of the transformation. The prophet Isaiah wrote in the book of Isaiah chapter 40 verse 31, that those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. Notice what the verse does not say. It does not say that strength comes only after the waiting ends. It teaches that renewal happens while waiting on God. In other words, waiting is not merely the space between prayers and answers. It is a sacred place where God shapes the heart. Many believers miss this because they focus entirely on the outcome. They become so concerned with reaching the next chapter that they overlook what God is doing in the current one. Yet some of the deepest spiritual growth occurs when a person continues trusting God without visible evidence that anything is changing. That kind of faith cannot be manufactured. It is forged. And often when heaven feels silent, God is teaching lessons that could never be learned through comfort alone. The remarkable truth is that many of the things you are asking God to do around you may begin with something He wants to do within you first. This leads us to a forgotten biblical truth that has restored hope to countless believers during their darkest seasons of spiritual dryness. The forgotten truth that restores faith during spiritual dryness. One of the most overlooked truths in the Christian life is that God's faithfulness is not measured by our feelings. Yet many believers unknowingly build their spiritual confidence on emotions. When they feel inspired, they believe God is near. When they feel peace, they believe their faith is strong. When they feel encouraged, they assume everything is spiritually healthy. But what happens when those feelings disappear? What happens when the worship songs no longer move you the same way, when your prayers feel empty, or when your heart feels numb, despite your desire to remain close to God? This is where many people begin to panic. They assume something is wrong. They assume God has stepped away. They assume their faith is dying. But Scripture repeatedly teaches that faith is strongest when it rests on God's character rather than human emotions. The Apostle Paul understood this deeply. His life was filled with hardships, persecution, uncertainty, and suffering. Yet his confidence in God remained stable because it was anchored in who God is, not in how he felt on a particular day. This forgotten truth changes everything. God's presence is a reality before it is a feeling. His promises remain true, even during seasons when emotions struggle to confirm them. The Bible never says that believers will always feel strong. It never says they will always feel close to God. It never says they will always understand what God is doing. What it does say is that God remains faithful. The letter to the Hebrews reminds us that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That means His character does not fluctuate with your circumstances. His love does not weaken because your faith feels weak. His mercy does not disappear because your prayers feel dry. His presence is not removed because your emotions are unsettled. This truth becomes an anchor during spiritual drought. Just as a tree survives difficult seasons because its roots reach deeper than what is visible above the ground, believers endure spiritual dryness by rooting themselves in God's unchanging nature. Many people are waiting to feel their way back to God, but often, restoration begins when you choose to trust Him before the feelings return. The surprising reality is that some of the most mature believers are not those who always feel spiritually strong. They are those who continue walking with God when strength seems absent. And once this truth takes root in your heart, something powerful begins to happen. You stop searching for fulfillment in places that were never meant to satisfy your soul, and you begin moving back toward the one who has been waiting for you all along. The moment you stop searching in the wrong places and return to God. When people feel spiritually lost, their first instinct is often to search for something that will quickly remove the discomfort. Some pursue distractions. Others bury themselves in work, entertainment, achievements, relationships, social media, or endless activity. They hope that if they stay busy enough, the emptiness will eventually disappear. For a moment, these things may provide relief. But relief is not the same as restoration. The deeper problem remains. Because the spiritual hunger within the human heart was never designed to be satisfied by temporary substitutes. This is one of the central messages woven throughout Scripture. Again and again, people drift toward things they believe will fulfill them, only to discover that those things cannot carry the weight of their deepest needs. The soul continues searching. The emptiness remains. The questions persist. Why? Because spiritual longing is ultimately a signal. It is not merely the absence of something. It is often an invitation toward someone. In the Gospel of Luke chapter 15, Jesus told the story of the prodigal son. The young man believed fulfillment existed somewhere far from his father. He pursued freedom on his own terms. He chased experiences that promised satisfaction. For a while, it seemed exciting. But eventually everything collapsed. And it was in that broken place that he realized something important. What he truly needed was not farther away. It was back where he had started. The Father's house had always been the answer. Many believers experience a similar journey. They spend years searching for peace in circumstances, achievements, approval, control, certainty, or worldly success. Yet even after obtaining some of those things, a quiet emptiness remains. Because the deepest need of the soul is not success. It is communion with God. The remarkable truth is that God does not wait for perfect people before welcoming them back. He does not require complete understanding. He does not demand flawless faith. He simply invites people to return. This invitation appears throughout the Bible. Return to me. Seek me. Draw near to me. These words reveal the heart of God. A God who does not delight in distance. A God who continually pursues His children even when they feel lost. Perhaps the reason you are watching this right now is because that invitation is reaching you again. Not through fear, not through condemnation, but through grace. The feeling of being spiritually lost may actually be exposing a deeper truth. Your soul was never meant to find its home in anything less than God Himself. And when that truth finally settles into your heart, the wilderness begins to look very different. What once appeared to be a season of abandonment may actually have been preparation for one of the most important spiritual discoveries of your life. Your spiritual wilderness may be preparing your greatest encounter with God. If there is one truth I hope you carry with you after this message, it is this. Feeling spiritually lost does not mean God has abandoned you. In fact, some of the most important moments in a believer's life begin in seasons that feel confusing, uncertain, and painfully silent. Throughout Scripture, God repeatedly met people in deserts, prisons, wildernesses, storms, and seasons of waiting. He met them in places where answers were scarce and faith was being tested. What appeared to be the end of the story often became the beginning of something far greater. Perhaps that is exactly where you are right now. Perhaps you have been measuring God's presence by your emotions. Perhaps you have been interpreting silence as absence. Perhaps you have been questioning yourself because you cannot understand why your spiritual journey feels different than it once did. But what if this season is not evidence of failure? What if it is preparation? What if God is using this wilderness to deepen your faith, strengthen your trust, and draw you closer to Him than ever before? The Bible shows us that God often does His greatest work beneath the surface long before visible change appears. Roots grow before fruit. Character develops before promotion. Trust matures before understanding. And many times God reveals His purpose only after the journey has already transformed the person walking through it. So do not lose heart. Do not assume that confusion has the final word. Do not believe the lie that your spiritual struggle means God has forgotten you. The very fact that your heart still longs for Him is evidence that He is continuing to draw you closer. Keep praying. Keep seeking. Keep trusting. Even when answers are delayed. Even when emotions fluctuate. Even when the path ahead seems unclear. Because the God who guided Joseph through prison, Moses through the wilderness, David through hardship, and the disciples through confusion is the same God who is walking with you today. One day you may look back on this season and realize that what felt like spiritual lostness was actually God's way of leading you into a deeper relationship with Him. And that may become one of the greatest testimonies of your entire life.